It's time for us to get started. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 12. Deuteronomy 12, and we're going to try to make a good bit of headway tonight through. Sorry. Not a great start. Right, you may want to start us off while I switch these up. Wait.
Well, we're just talking about Moses' instructions for the people before they entered the land of the Promised Land, and he just is going over a lot of different things about the laws, and he gets very specific now about the decrees that they were to obey. You want to start off with chapter 12?
Yeah, sure. That'd be great. So chapter 12 begins a section where we're going to focus on laws about worship. And I want you to notice there's a key phrase that repeats itself several times through this chapter. And actually, it shows up several times throughout the book and then throughout the rest of the Old Testament. But it's in verse 5. You shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose. I think that repeats itself 4 or 5 times, maybe 6 in this chapter, and then maybe another dozen times throughout the rest of the book of Deuteronomy. And so we'll try to make sense of that as we go through. But I think 1 through 11 are fundamentals, and then 12 through 26-ish are specifics. So here are the rules, basically, chapter 12 says. I want you to love me, fear me, serve me. Now here are the statutes. Here are the commandments that you need to follow. And he says in verse 2, you shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars, and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. All right, so this is really a parallel with chapter 7, but what were they supposed to do to the idol places and images? Destroy them, right? We're completely wiping all of that out. We're deleting the idols from off the scene, and we're only going to worship Yahweh. God and the idols will not exist together. He did not have a coexist bumper sticker, right? No coexistence. Just wiping them out and replacing it with Him. This idea that the place that the Lord your God will choose. I think that it's referred to that way because they don't know exactly where that place is going to be yet. Ultimately, it will be Jerusalem. It'll be where the temple is. And one of the things that we will see is that up until the point where the temple is built, it looks to me like maybe some of the sacrifices could be made kind of on location. I think you see that maybe in early in the book of Samuel and on into before Solomon's reign, that there's sacrifices kind of being made in different places. But then remember that once the temple is built, the high places are no longer allowed. I think there were probably high places where they were worshiping Yahweh. But here, he says, you're not going to do that anymore in those places. You're going to come to the place that God will choose. It's all consolidated there. And we get some insight into why that is the case later on in the chapter. I don't know. Let me just say this about verse 7. They're going to bring their offerings and their contributions and their tithes and all of this to the Lord, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. It's really interesting because in chapter 6 and chapter 8, he talked about a possible response to God's blessing. Do you remember what that response could have been? What the potential response was to all of the blessings that they were given? They could forget. They could forget God. They could become so affluent that they forgot God. It doesn't have to be that way, right? You don't have to respond to God's blessings with forgetting Him. You could respond to God's blessings with joy and returning it to Him. And that's what Moses calls them to here in chapter 12. Somebody might read chapter 6 and chapter 8 and say, well, I guess we should just write off wealth. I guess we should just write off blessing, just not have any part of it. Well, that's an option, I guess. That's not the best option. The best option is to take the good things God has given us and respond appropriately to them, which Moses shows here is possible.
We're going to see later on in the divided kingdom that they did turn to offering idols on the high places. Offering sacrifices on the high places, and that will be quite a bit later on. Yeah,
that's right. You remember that passage in Leviticus 17 where he says, "Don't offer on your own, lest you be caught up with the goat demons," or I think some translations say Azazel, which raises a lot of questions to me. But I think one of the dangers is that if people were kind of just doing it, making their sacrifices on their own, that it's not controlled like it was supposed to be. And it's not regulated like it was supposed to be. And the temple, the priests and the Levites were supposed to oversee all of this to make sure it was done in an appropriate way. And so this is, for example, in verse 13, take care that you do not offer burnt offerings at any place that you see, but at the place that the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I'm commanding you. So that it was not just a free-for-all. There was a place to come and do this, and probably for quality control reasons. I think basically. Now, I don't know exactly what you're thinking of with that question, but one thing I would say is that you would read through earlier places like Samuel. He's traveling around and offering sacrifices in different places. I think basically that's before it was centralized, that maybe it was more allowed. Because he says, what's this in verse 8? You shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever is right in his own eyes. Now, most of the time when we see that in the Bible, that's probably talking about something sinful, right? But I think basically he's saying everybody is kind of doing their own thing. And I think he's saying that's not going to be the way it is when you get there, when there's a settled place. You will follow the procedure and not just do what you think is okay. All right. In what way? Oh, yeah, that for sure. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yes. Destroying idols. There is a spiritual application, certainly, of the destroying idols. I mean, we serve the same idols they did. We just give them different names, right? They called them Baal and Ashtaroth and all that. And we just call them money and lust and power, things like that. Yeah, not doing it our own way.
It's not like every family had a written copy.
Right.
So they lean heavily on oral traditions.
Yes.
Like that. But, you can kind of see the wisdom having the priest lead in this.
Yeah. And it certainly looks like, especially as you get on into the United Kingdom and divided kingdom, that they were just combining the worship of the Lord with the worship of all these idols, and it was just getting so, it was just mongrelized of religion. So they're wanting to keep it pure. I think that's the idea here.
That's one of the reasons why God wanted them to eliminate everybody and don't make no treaties with them, so it would just be the Israelites. But they let all these different other people that they were conquering made friendship with them, and their teachings of the idols and all corrupted the children of Israel, even though they knew that it was wrong to do it.
That's right. Yeah. All right. Mr. Dwight, you carry us through whatever of 12 you want to, make whatever comments about 12, or however you want to approach that.
That's So.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have anything through 12? We're going to have to kind of just look at this chapter by subject more so than verse by verse. But if there's anything in there that you have a question about, we'll try to do the best we can with that. He does specify this is not about killing an animal to eat it. Right. In 12, he explains you got an animal, you want to kill it, like as long as you follow the proper procedure, that's fine. What he's talking about here are things that are being sacrificed. And that's where the distinctions lie. Yeah.
So are we back?
Yes, I think so.
So I just want to point out verse 32.
Yeah.
Everything I command you, careful to do, shall not add to it, take away from it. And I think we definitely see a lot of obey, but it's interesting here talk about not adding and taking away from it. I think we need to hear that because they're going to do something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. All right. Anything else through 12? All right. You want to take us through 13?
In chapter 13, he's talking about what should happen and will happen to those who do turn to idols. And the first verse there, he's talking about someone who claims to be a prophet. And he says that if he gives you a sign and a wonder, and the sign or wonder comes to pass, of which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, which you have not known, and let us serve them. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with your soul. Notice what he said there in verse 3. God is testing them. He allows us to be tested today. He allowed them to be tested. You remember Job. He allowed Job to be tested. He was a righteous man. And but God allows us to be tested, and that's why we prove our faith and our love to Him is whether how we respond to those tests. And also look in verse 5. What was the punishment for that prophet? Put to death, right? And so look at verse 6. If your brother, the son of your mother, your son or your daughter, the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is as your own soul secretly entices you, saying, let us go and serve other gods which you have not known, neither you nor your fathers, of the gods of the people which are all around you, near to you, or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, you shall not consent to him or listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him or conceal him. Look at verse 9. What will be the punishment for those near kinsmen who entice you to serve other gods?
Stone to death.
Right. And in verse 10 it says, and you shall stone him with stones until he dies, because he sought to entice you away from your Lord, the Lord your God. In verse 11, what was the purpose of that stoning?
To make an impression on us.
Right, exactly. Others would be afraid, right, to do the very same thing. In verse 15, he talks about a city that turns to idols, which would be a possibility, I guess. And he says, you shall surely strike the city, the inhabitants of that city, with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying it, and all that's in it and its livestock with the edge of the sword. And in verse 16, it says even the spoils should be piled up in the streets and burned, and the city was never to be rebuilt again. So it must remain in ruins forever. God is serious about idols worship, isn't he? He's very serious. Do you have anything to say on that chapter?
Can I ask you a question? Is verse 5, is that the first time we see, so you shall first in Deuteronomy? The first time we see it? Because it comes up.
Yeah. First time I remember it.
That would be a thing.
Yeah. get rid of the evil influence, and especially with regards to idolatry. If it showed up in chapter 7, I would not be surprised, but I don't remember it there. Because in chapter 7, he's not really talking about them turning to idolatry. He's talking about the nations that are already there. But, yeah. These cities that turn to idolatry, they receive the same punishment that the Canaanite cities that they're going in to take get. You do Canaanite things, you get Canaanite punishments. And actually, it's even worse, because in the Canaanite cities, they were not required to destroy the livestock and the infrastructure, the buildings and the vineyards. But if a city of the Lord turned to idolatry, raze it to the ground, every bit of it, livestock, it's almost, well, it's not almost. It was a more egregious sin for God's chosen people to turn to idolatry than it was even for the Canaanites, who were already pretty bad off. They're pretty wicked. All right, anything else through 13? So chapter 14, I think, so 12 and 13 laws about worship and only worshiping Yahweh. 14 and following, at least for a couple of chapters, really kind of 14 through maybe the end of 16, is food and festivals. Some instructions about that. So the first instruction is one that we've thought a little bit about, and that is the idea of clean and unclean animals. And I like the way that it's framed here in Deuteronomy. This is chapter 14, verse 1. You are the sons of Yahweh your God. You shall not gash yourselves nor shave your forehead for the sake of the dead. Evidently that was a pagan, Canaanite, idolatrous practice, to cut into your head in honor or in mourning for the dead. Verse 2, for you are a holy people to Yahweh your God, and Yahweh has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. So there's two things that are said about them. They are God's sons, they are God's children, and they are holy. And being God's children and being holy comes with special blessings. You can see that in the early parts of Deuteronomy. Because they were God's sons, because he loved them, he showed them special affection and concern. Because they were holy, he protected them and took care of them. But they also come with special obligations. That if you're going to be the sons of God, if you're going to be a holy people to God, there's a higher calling. And in this case, he talks about the not eating certain animals. And I don't know that we could go through and identify, okay, why is that animal allowed and that one not, and that animal allowed and that one not. Maybe there's some good guesses. But I think basically the idea is because it's teaching them lessons about holiness. Leviticus chapter 20 makes that point and says, you are to make this distinction because I have made a distinction. I have separated you out from the peoples, so you make a separation when it comes to what you eat. Now, also in chapter 14, so that takes us through verse 21. Also, he says here, talks about bringing the tithe. And this is, again, another way to emphasize the right response to God's blessing. They bring a tithe, and it looks to me like in verse 23, they are to eat from the produce that they bring from the tithe. So it was not only a burden. They would come to Jerusalem, they would bring their tithe, and they would celebrate with that too, eating and drinking and making merry. And then at the end, this is verse 28, of every third year, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in that year and shall deposit it within your gates. So the Levite, the one who has no portion or inheritance among you, the sojourner, the orphan, the widow who are within your gates shall come and eat and be satisfied, in order that Yahweh your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. God would bless them, but that blessing was tied to, one, bringing the tithe each year, but also setting aside an amount for the poor and for the Levite, who is dependent on that in order for them to be provided for. Any questions through chapter 14? I'm sure there are some that you could ask if you wanted to. I was afraid somebody was going to ask why he says not to boil a young goat in his mother's milk. You have an answer? I don't either.
Well, we're used to never getting a good answer.
Yeah, good. Yeah. I have read, like, Austin and I have talked about it recently. I've read commentaries on it, and I have not found one thing that I thought, well, that nails it down. Like, there are some good guesses, I guess, but I just, it just does seem wrong, though, doesn't it? It would just be kind of cruel to boil a young goat in its mother's milk. That would be kind of sad on the surface.
That could be a potential problem.
Yeah, like, yeah, like every law. Like, this is because somebody has been out there trying to do this before. Why? But anyway. Okay. I think, do we have, you want to say something about chapter 15? I think we've talked some about
Well, that was
the sabbatical year before. Yeah.
Where all the debts were canceled in that year. All the Israelites would forgive each other of their debts if they had some.
There is some kind of, maybe it's maybe not funny, but it is interesting to me in this chapter. In 11 and verse 4, he says, "There will be no needy one among you, since Yahweh will surely bless you in the land which Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess. If only you listen obediently to the voice of Yahweh your God to be careful to do all this commandment which I'm commanding you today." So basically he's saying, if you listen to me, there won't be any needy, right? Why? Because they've got all these provisions in place. All of these things that God has set into place to keep people from protections for land being passed down. You know, every 50 years, that resetting so that no family is land poor. You know, you've got these provisions for things being set aside in the meantime so that even people maybe who have sold their land for that 50 years can find ways to survive. But then look at verse 11. "For the needy will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I'm commanding you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother till you're afflicted in the needy of your land." It almost seems contradictory, doesn't it? There will be no needy, verse 4. Verse 11, "The needy will never cease being in the land." And I think this is what Jesus is quoting when he says, "The poor will be with you always," in Matthew 26. I think he's referencing this. So what does that tell us? If he says, there will be no needy, because you're going to listen to me, there will always be needy in the land. They're not going to listen. They're not going to listen. And so he is appealing to those who will listen. You're going to have to be generous. You're going to have to be thoughtful. You're going to have to be considerate of your brethren, because if the larger structure of taking care of the poor isn't followed, then it's going to depend on your generosity for that. And I wonder, even if when Jesus quotes that in Matthew 26, if it's not a little bit of a prick at people like Judas and the religious leaders when he says, "The poor you'll have with you always." And why is that the case? It's because you've ignored God's laws all along. You're so worried, oh, this could have been taken and sold, and it could have been. Yeah, but really, we wouldn't have to be worrying about that if everybody did what they were supposed to. You wouldn't have to worry about that if the religious leaders had kept in place the structures that God put. You're worried about it now. Where was your concern about that when for the last 2,000 years, when everything's been like this, 1,400 years anyway? Okay, what else through chapter 15? Dwight, anything about slavery or something like that?
There's a 7-year rule for servants too. The bond servants, they were to serve for 6 and be released in the 7th. There in verse 12 through 14, and you remember how that God would bless them in the 6th year. He'd give them plenty of overbless them, you might say, so that it and so he says, pass that on to someone else. In verse 15, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this thing today." And there may be a situation where the slaves will not want to leave, that they could remain with their masters. But there in the rest of the chapter, it's about the law about the firstborn animals. That strictly was the Lord's, and they were to give them to the Lord. If the firstborn was a defective animal, they could eat it. But chapter 16, it just talks about the feast days that they were to observe. And there was 3 of those major feasts. Do you remember what they were?
Passover's one. Heard that. Feast of Weeks. Feast of Booths. That's right. Do what? Tabernacles. Feast of Booths. Sukkot is the, I don't know how to pronounce it, but anyway. Feast of Weeks. Anybody know what we know that is in the New Testament? Came 50 days after Passover. Pentecost. Yeah, Pentecost. That's the Greek word for 50, and it comes, I think it's on the day after you take 49, 7 sevens, and then the day after would be be Pentecost. Yeah. I do want you to notice that the feasts are connected with remembrance, almost all of them, and in some way or another. The Passover, remembering the night they come up out of Egypt. The Feast of Weeks, he says, so really this is really a celebration of the first fruits of the harvest, which makes it fitting for the day of Pentecost, doesn't it? The first fruits of the harvest of the new covenant. But look at verse 12. And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, right? You couldn't celebrate the first fruits in Egypt. They weren't your first fruits, right? They were somebody else's. And then the Feast of Booths, I think in other places is connected with their sojourning. That's why they dwell in tents. They're remembering the time where they were wanderers. But this one is especially, this would be at the time of harvest, and it's in gratitude for the blessing of the bountiful harvest that they've been given. Then at the end of 16, I think we have a transition to laws for civil society and laws about leaders specifically. And he says basically that the judges that they appoint need to be people who are righteous judges and don't accept bribes, that they pursue righteousness, and then also, again, another warning against idolatry in verses 21 and 22, planting an Asherah tree or a sacred pillar. A lot of these cults and pagan rituals would be associated with trees because they represented life or something like that. And so planting those trees would have been forbidden. All right. Anything through 16 you'd like to say? Good, right. Any questions, comments through 16? All right. We're making good time. It's looking promising. Chapter 17. Let's see. Anything you'd like to say there before? Anything specifically, points you'd like to make there?
He's still talking about those who turn to idols and their punishment. Mm-hmm. They were to be stoned to death there. He just repeats it there. And in verse 6, he talks about that there must be 2 or 3 witnesses. Mm-hmm. And if they're found guilty, the witnesses are to throw the first stone. In verse 7 there, it's what it says. So if you're going to be an eyewitness, you have a responsibility that goes along with that, and that is to be the one to throw the first stone. Believes in capital punishment, doesn't it?
Yes, that's right. But you also, so the punishment is severe, and then there are protections to keep people from being just falsely accused of this, right? There's a thorough investigation. There have to be witnesses. The witnesses have to take the lead in doing this, and later we will come to it in a bit. But there will be a rule that if someone accuses someone of a crime and they didn't do it, it's found that was made up, then they suffer whatever punishment that person would have gotten. Well, that would turn down the false accusations for sure.
Was to encourage the people to actually do God's commandment.
That's right.
And by execution like that, I mean, if you had that today, I mean, you wouldn't have the crime rate because all the ones that was actually doing the crimes, that doesn't be dead. And then you wouldn't have, and the judges, because the way it says God set up the judges,
Yeah.
if you wasn't righteous and you're crooked, they'd eliminate them too. So you'd have a more perfect society than you would now.
That's right. Yeah. The challenge is, well, yeah, you're exactly right. It is true that if there was public punishment for sin, and careful investigations of those, those would go hand in hand. That God's way is best here, and the issue with Israel and the issue with any people is that there is a limited selection of people who care about righteousness, and so it doesn't take very long for the whole system to get perverted. But that you're exactly right there. You do notice that the rulings of the Levites and the priests and the judges that have been appointed, they're binding, and people are not allowed to just ignore those sorts of things. I love this section here about the king in chapter 17. This is the standard by which all the kings will be measured. 1st and 2nd Samuel, well, 2nd Samuel, First Samuel and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. The evaluation of the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings is based on Deuteronomy 17. And basically, the evaluation of the king is based on whether or not they helped or hindered people in their loyalty to the Lord. And so he says that you shouldn't, you're going to have a king, and he shall not multiply horses for himself. He shall not multiply wives for himself. This is, and the end of verse 17. He shall not greatly increase silver and gold for himself. So war implements, wives, and wealth. He doesn't need to get a lot of those. I think every other ancient kingdom would have read that and think, what are kings for then? Like, the whole point of having a king was for him to gather stuff for making war, to have wives, to make allegiances and alliances, and to gather wealth, right, for the sake of the kingdom. And actually God says, yeah, all the ways that all the other nations measure the worth of their kings, I want him to go the opposite way and not gather a lot of those. Not a lot of war horses, not a lot of wealth, not a lot of wives. You can see so I think Solomon is a great example of the danger of gathering all of that. But what is he supposed to get for himself, right? He's not supposed to get wives, women, and wealth. Wives, war horses, and wealth. What's he supposed to get for himself? The law. The law. He makes a copy of the law for himself. Accumulate to himself knowing the law and leading as an example in following it. This is verse 19. That he may learn to fear Yahweh his God, to carefully observe all the words of this law and these statutes. That his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or the left, so that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his sons in the midst of Israel. So basically, he's saying, don't let the king think he's better than anybody else. Now, the whole world at the time, the whole world now would say, of course the king's better than everybody else, right? He's the one in charge. He says, no, he's not any better than anybody else. The king is not the one in charge. God is. And he has to submit himself to that. Now, you can imagine somebody having read Deuteronomy 17 and looking at the kings as we go through Samuel and Kings and just saying, boy, we missed it. And longing for a better king.
Well, when you mentioned Solomon, I mean, he was supposed to have been the wisest man that ever lived and was king.
Yeah.
And he knew God's law.
Mm-hmm.
And he had Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
And he broke everything that's in there. I mean, they said that gold and silver, silver was useless. It's like sand. And everything that he had was made out of gold. And he had all the horses, the chariots, wives, concubines.
Yeah. Yeah. 300 wives, 700 concubines? I don't even know 1,000 people. He was married to 1,000. Oh.
But it's sad that, that he had found favor in God and then he broke all the commandments. Deuteronomy.
That's right. Yeah, in the best position to be what this said, but not. Yeah. All right. Anything else you want to say through 17? Take us through 18 if you want.
In chapter 18, of course, we've already talked about this quite a bit. It's talking about the Levites and how they were to be to live off of the offerings that were made to the Lord. And there's no really need to talk about that very much. They were also given cities to live in. They were scattered out throughout the nation. And in verse 9, it talks about how that they were to not participate in the customs of the nations that they were that was before them there. And it gives an example there about sacrificing their children to gods, or practicing witchcraft and sorcery. But he says that you shouldn't be like the wicked people around them. That's a good lesson for anyone today. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're surrounded by wicked people, then be careful and don't do as they do. In verse 15, through the rest of the chapters, is a very important section of scripture there. In verse 15, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him shall you hear. And in verse 18, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him. So who's he speaking about here? A prophet like Moses. Who? Christ, yes. So this is a very important section of scripture about Christ here. Would you like to say something?
No, I'll just say something about the end there. He says that that these prophets that are raised up along the way, and even Jesus, if you don't listen, I will require it of him. He will speak with God's authority. I like this in verse 20. But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. I think that's an example of the binding of silence. God's silence. When God is silent about something, do we have the okay to just go on ahead and do it anyway? And he said, no, if the prophet goes on ahead and presumes to say that I'm okay with something when I hadn't given him that command, then he'll die too. So now notice this 21 and 22. How do we know if this is from the Lord? If he does a sign and it doesn't come to pass, that ain't him, right? It's not from God. It is interesting, though, that just because the sign does come to pass doesn't necessarily equal authenticity, doesn't it? And the way you know that is chapter 13 said, here comes a dreamer, or here comes a prophet, he says something, and then he says, let's go worship other gods. And what did Moses say? No divinely sent messenger, no Lord sent messenger will ever say, let's go serve other gods. And so that's important there. So as we go into chapter 19, cities of refuge, we've talked quite a bit about those. But in verse 14, there's a rule about not moving your neighbor's boundary mark, which the ancestors have said, in your inheritance, which you will inherit in the land that Yahweh your God gives you to possess. God had given them the land. It was his land to give to them. So the boundary markers mattered. And really, that's kind of an expression of the commandment, you shall not steal, is to move your neighbor's boundary marker. And then in 15 and following is the passage that I mentioned earlier about what about a malicious witness, a witness that rises up to falsely accuse. And basically, he says that person would be charged with whatever they would be punished with, whatever punishment they were seeking against the other person. Okay. Anything through 19? I don't know if there was something specific about the cities of refuge that you wanted to ask about there, but I think basically we've covered that before. All right. Chapter 20?
This is just about rules for going to war. Of course, the Israelites' enemies were the Canaanites, and God had ordered them to remove them from the land. And he says in verse 1, when you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses, chariots, and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. So he says, don't be afraid of them. God's with you. If the spies at Kadesh Barnea had remembered that, then they would have had a lot less heartaches and problems. But there's a ritual there that they went through before they went to war in beginning in verse 2. So it shall be when you are on the verge of a battle that the priest shall speak to the people, and he'll say to them, today you're on the verge of a battle. Do not let your heart faint. Do not be afraid, and do not tremble or be terrified because of them. For the Lord God, He goes with you to fight for you against your enemies. He goes on and talks about, gives some exemptions from war. There were some exemptions that they could use to not have to go to war. A soldier who built a new house. I thought that was interesting. He said, stay home, enjoy your house. He says, if he's planted a vineyard, go home and enjoy it. If he's engaged to a woman, go home, because there's a possibility that you might get killed in the battle and someone else would marry her. And another thing is, if you're afraid, go home, because they didn't want to cause fear upon anyone else that was going to war at that time. But so the size of the army wasn't important, was it? It was they needed to depend on God. And when they would get near a city to fight, verse 10, they were to offer a peace to it, and if they accepted it, if they didn't accept it, then they were to besiege that city and kill the males, but spare the women and children and livestock for their plunder. And but the cities, verse 16, but the cities of these people which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them, and lest they, look in verse 18, so that they don't teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their God. So the major cities that they were going to attack, they were to utterly destroy everything and everybody in them. And the reason was so that they didn't influence them the wrong way.
Yeah. Comments, questions? Yeah. Okay. Very good. So, chapter 21. Can we look at this quickly? I think potentially. The beginning of 21, from 1 to verse 9, is about somebody who is killed, but it's not known who did it. Right, so it's an unsolved murder. What should be done in that case? Well, a sacrifice needs to be made. Atonement has to be made. And what they're going to do is they're going to take a heifer that has never pulled a yoke, and they are going to basically sacrifice that heifer, and that is going to be the means by which the blood guilt is taken off of the city. Obviously, they would have put to death the person who had done it if they had known. But in the case that they don't know, they do this. Now, in verses 10 through 21, there are questions about family relationships. So one of them, I think, is particularly pertinent. They go and they attack that city from chapter 20. They bring back captives, and some of the captives that they bring back are women. But they have to provide time, and they have to provide sustenance and all of that to the woman. One commentator had a quote on that I thought was interesting. It says, the physical and emotional needs of the woman in her utter vulnerability are given moral and legal protection over the desires and claims of the man and his victorious strength. So there's a waiting period, there are provisions that have to be met and all of that. And somebody says, well, I can't believe that the Bible would allow that. And I'm not saying this as like a justification, but just think about what the other ancient cultures would have done when they go in and they take a city. Right? Is there any concern at all for the physical and emotional well-being of these women? No. What God is saying is, listen, you offered terms of peace. Verse 10 said, they didn't take them. You take this woman to be your wife. There's still rules in place. And you have to take care of her forever. Right? There's no, if you're going to, you can't just keep her as a slave or mistreat her or something like that. And there's more about that we could look at the end of chapter 21, but we're out of time. So thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.